There is a version of this story that Hollywood loves to tell about itself. Two people meet, fall in love, get famous together, and then, because fame rarely leaves a marriage intact, they fall apart. Danny DeVito and Rhea Perlman lived through every beat of that story except the ending. They met young. They got famous together. They separated twice. And more than 50 years after a chance night at an off-Broadway play, they are still, by DeVito's own account, each other's family in every sense that matters, still legally married, still talking every day, still showing up for birthdays and grandchildren and Sunday dinners. It is not the ending anyone expected, and it may be the only ending that ever made sense for them. To understand why a man who has spent 5 decades being underestimated calls one relationship the defining achievement of his life, you have to go back to a small theater, a play nobody remembers, and a woman who wasn't even supposed to be paying attention to the stage. In January of 1971, Rhea Perlman was 23 years old, a working actress from Brooklyn who had grown up the daughter of a toy industry worker and studied drama in college before doing the unglamorous work most young actors do in New York. Waiting tables, going to auditions, showing up for friends' shows because that's what you do in a small, striving community of people all trying to make it. She went to a single off-Broadway performance of a play called The Shrinking Bride, and she went for one reason only. A friend of hers was in the cast. She never really watched her friend. On that stage was a stocky, 5'0" actor named Danny DeVito, and whatever he was doing up there, it pulled her attention away from everything else in the room. Perlman later described the moment with characteristic bluntness. She told the New York Post that she felt she, sight index equals 10-1, had to meet him immediately and asked a friend whether he had a girlfriend. /sight, he didn't. Perlman didn't wait for a formal introduction, telling interviewers over the years, in different words but the same spirit, that sight index equals 3-1, she came on to him big time. /sight. They went to dinner after the show. Within 2 weeks, Perlman had moved into DeVito's Manhattan apartment. A fast, almost reckless start for two people who would go on to build one of the most durable partnerships in American entertainment. Sight index equals 3-1, 11-1. They moved in together 2 weeks after meeting and were married on January 28, 1982 /sight. More than a decade after they'd first found each other, and long after most couples would have already made it official one way or another. DeVito has talked about those early years in strikingly plain language, without the varnish people usually apply to origin stories once they've become part of a public narrative. Speaking to AARP the magazine in 2026, he recalled that sight index equals 4-1. He and Perlman simply hit it off, that they liked off-Broadway theater and went to movies constantly, and that they even made short films together in those years. /sight, he summed up the pairing with a line that has stuck with people who've heard it. Sight index equals 4-1. A nice Jewish girl from Brooklyn and an Italian guy from New Jersey, and he cooked while she ate. /sight, it's a small, domestic image, not a Hollywood love story, just two people who like spending time together and turn out to be very good at it. What makes their 11-year engagement, if you can even call it that, since neither of them seemed in a hurry to formalize anything, interesting isn't that they were waiting for the right moment. It's that they didn't seem to need the paperwork to know what they had. They were building a life together long before there was a ring or a ceremony attached to it. Sharing an apartment, sharing ambitions, and eventually sharing a career. DeVito's rise through the 1970s was not fast and not easy. His height worked against him constantly in an industry that has always been unusually literal about what a leading man is supposed to look like. He built his early career on stage work and small parts, the kind of grinding, unglamorous work that either breaks an actor's spirit or toughens it. His break came through a friendship with Michael Douglas, whom he'd known from an acting workshop years earlier. When Douglas became a producer on the film adaptation of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, he pushed for DeVito to be cast as Martini, a psychiatric patient DeVito had actually played years before in a stage production of the same story. The film, released in 1975, swept the major Academy Awards categories. DeVito wasn't nominated, but the role put him in front of the industry in a way nothing had before. Then in 1978, DeVito made a decision that people around him considered close to career suicide. He turned down other film work to audition for a television sitcom called Taxi, playing Louis De Palma, a dispatcher who was petty, mean, and completely unapologetic about it. The kind of character actors are usually warned away from because there's no built-in likability to fall back on. DeVito took the part anyway, on a contract that reportedly paid him less than most of his castmates. It became the role that made him a household name. And then, in the show's second season, Rhea Perlman joined the cast as Zena Sherman, Louis' on-again, off-again girlfriend. Producers didn't know DeVito and Perlman had been a couple for years by that point. The chemistry between the characters read as simply excellent acting, when in truth it was two people who already understood each other in a way that took no performing at all. Perlman's own career took off around the same time DeVito's did. In 1982, the same year they finally married, she began playing Carla Tortelli on Cheers, the sharp-tongued barmaid who became one of the most recognizable comic characters on American television. The role earned her 4 Emmy Awards, a fact DeVito has talked about with visible pride whenever it comes up, treating her success as something closer to his own than to a spouse's separate achievement. Working side by side became something like a habit for them, not a coincidence. They appeared together on-screen multiple times across the decades. On Taxi, later in the ratings game, and most memorably in the 1996 film adaptation of Roald Dahl's Matilda, which DeVito directed and in which the couple played the appallingly selfish Wormwood parents. It's a strange, almost self-aware bit of casting. Two people who by every account adored their own children playing two parents who couldn't be bothered with theirs, and doing it well enough that audiences believed every second of it. Behind the scenes of that production was something the film's marketing never touched on. The young actress cast as Matilda, Mara Wilson, was dealing with her mother's serious illness during filming. Wilson has spoken publicly in the years since about how supportive DeVito and Perlman were toward her during that period. Not as employers managing a child actor, but as adults who seemed to genuinely care what happened to her outside the hours she spent on set. It's a detail that surfaces again and again when people who've worked with the couple talk about them. A pattern of quiet decency that had nothing to do with cameras rolling. While Taxi was still airing, DeVito and Perlman started something that would end up shaping American independent film for the next 2 decades. A production company called Jersey Films, founded in 1983 and run largely on nights and weekends around their acting schedules. It grew into one of the more consequential independent production outfits of its era, with credits that include Pulp Fiction, Aaron Brockovich, Get Shorty, Out of Sight, and Garden State, among others. The Pulp Fiction story in particular says a lot about how DeVito operated as a producer. Quentin Tarantino had already been turned away by other studios by the time the project landed with Jersey Films. DeVito and his partners backed it, gave Tarantino the resources and creative room to make the film his own way, and let him shoot it on a modest budget that ended up looking far more expensive than it actually was. It's the kind of bet that doesn't always pay off, and when it does, it tends to change the direction of an entire industry. In this case, it did. Running a production company, raising 3 children, Lucy, born in 1983, Grace, born in 1985, and Jake, born in 1987, and maintaining 2 acting careers at the same time would be enough to fracture most partnerships. For DeVito and Perlman, it seems to have been the connective tissue that kept them close. Whatever else was happening in their lives, they kept working on things together, treating creative collaboration less like a job and more like a shared language they never stopped speaking. In October of 2012, after 30 years of marriage and more than 40 years together, DeVito and Perlman announced they were separating. The news landed hard with a public that had, for decades, held them up as one of the rare Hollywood pairings that seemed genuinely built to last. Side index equals 2-1. Perlman had once told People magazine, back in 1983, that DeVito was more fun and more exciting than the men she'd dated before him/Sight, and that early enthusiasm seemed to have held for 30 years, which made the separation news land as something closer to a shock than a rumor confirmed. Perlman has spoken about that period honestly, without pretending it was simple. On Julia Louis-Dreyfus' podcast Wiser Than Me, she acknowledged that things were genuinely difficult for a while, and that both she and DeVito were consumed by their work in ways that put real strain on the relationship. She's never gone much further into detail publicly than that, drawing a clear line between what belongs to the public and what doesn't. But the marriage didn't end there. By March of 2013, just 5 months after the separation was announced, the two had reconciled. They stayed together for several more years before separating again in 2017. And through both separations, they never filed for divorce. When a reporter from the New York Post asked Perlman directly why they'd never formally ended the marriage, her answer had the tone of someone who'd stopped feeling any need to dress up the truth. They'd been together a long time, there was a lot of love built up across that history, and they agreed on enough of what mattered that she saw no reason to complicate it with what she called the unpleasant parts of a divorce. That attitude has defined how both of them have talked about their relationship ever since. Asked on Watch What Happens Live in 2019 whether she and DeVito would ever formally divorce, Perlman's response was almost bewildered by the premise of the question, as if divorce, at this point, would solve a problem that didn't exist for either of them. In the years since their second separation, DeVito and Perlman have settled into something that doesn't map cleanly onto any familiar relationship category, and neither of them seems especially bothered by that. DeVito has said in multiple interviews that he lives near Perlman, that the two see each other constantly, and that their family, now including grandchildren, remains close-knit in a way that doesn't seem to have anything to do with their legal or romantic status. Speaking to Fox News Digital, DeVito described the current shape of the relationship in characteristically understated terms. Site index equals 9-1. They were doing great, sharing time with their granddaughter, and seeing each other constantly. Site, he mentioned attending their daughter Lucy's birthday together as a family, and summed the whole dynamic up simply. Site index equals 9-1. They were a tight family. Site, then he added something that reads almost like a thesis statement for the entire relationship. Reflecting on when he and Perlman first met, he said, site index equals 9-1, they'd been together that long, and you grow together. You really know how the other person is feeling all the time. Site, he described their day-to-day connection simply as constant conversation. That pattern has continued into more recent interviews. Talking to ARP, the magazine, DeVito described how the two remain fixtures in each other's daily lives, regularly at Perlman's house, sharing time with grandchildren, describing the current state of things simply as site index equals 4-1, 7-1. A good relationship, one built on being at each other's houses and spending time with the grandchildren together. Site, according to more recent reporting, the two still speak daily and meet regularly for meals, a rhythm that has held steady for years now. Regardless of their legal status as a couple, Perlman has echoed the same sentiment from her side. In 2022, she told People magazine that although they were still separated, they saw each other often and remained, in every practical sense, a family, capable of doing things together and doing things apart without either arrangement threatening the other. It's a philosophy of relationship that doesn't fit neatly into together or apart, and that seems to be exactly the point. Perlman put it even more plainly in one of the more quietly striking things either of them has said publicly. She sometimes missed the years when they were together in the traditional sense, calling those the glory days, but added that the years since have simply become a different kind of glory days. There's a lot packed into that one line. It's not nostalgia for what was lost, and it isn't denial that something changed. It's an acknowledgement that a relationship can shift shape entirely, go from marriage to separation to something that resembles neither, and still hold on to whatever made it worth having in the first place. None of this, the loyalty, the decades of closeness, the refusal to let a formal category define what they meant to each other, happened in isolation from who DeVito is as a performer and a person. His career has been built, from the very beginning, on the same stubborn refusal to be reshaped into something more conventional. He came up through an industry that, for most of his early career, simply didn't know what to do with an actor who looked like him. He built a name for himself anyway, first through stage work, then through One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, then through Taxi, and eventually through a string of films across the 1980s and 90s that made him one of the most recognizable character actors of his generation. Romancing the Stone Twins, Batman Returns, in which he played the Penguin, and Matilda, which he also directed. Later, he found an entirely new audience playing the deeply unpleasant Frank Reynolds on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, a role he took on in 2006 when the show was still an underdog and has stayed with for 2 decades since, a level of commitment that mirrors, in its own way, the loyalty that defines his relationship with Perlman. DeVito's physical stature comes from a genetic condition called multiple epiphyseal dysplasia, sometimes referred to as Fairbanks disease, which affects bone growth. He has spoken about the pressure that came with it over the years, the industry's long-standing preference for actors who look a certain way, and his own refusal to bend to that preference. What he has said, in various forms across interviews spanning decades, comes down to a consistent idea. He would rather be a genuine version of himself than a diminished copy of someone else's idea of what a leading man should look like. That same instinct toward authenticity and generosity has shown up in his philanthropic life as well, even if he hasn't always made a public show of it. In 2025, DeVito made a $500,000 donation to Jersey Shore University Medical Center in Neptune, New Jersey, the same hospital where he was born in 1944, to support cancer care and other services at the facility. He's spoken about the donation in simple, grounded terms, framing it less as a grand philanthropic gesture and more as a way of giving back to the community that shaped him. At 81, Danny DeVito is still working, still appearing on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, still taking on new film roles, still producing. And he is still, by his own account, deeply entangled in the life of the woman he met on a random night in a small theater more than 50 years ago. They are not, in any conventional sense, a couple anymore. They are also, in almost every practical sense that matters to either of them, still family, married on paper, separated in practice, and closer than most people manage to stay even when nothing has ever come between them. What DeVito and Perlman's relationship suggests, more than anything, is that the categories people use to sort relationships, married, divorced, together, apart, are often too small for what actually happens between two people who've spent half a century building a life side by side. They didn't need a wedding to know what they had in 1971. They don't seem to need a divorce to acknowledge what changed in 2012 and again in 2017. What they've kept, through all of it, is the thing that mattered from the very beginning. Two people who understand each other completely, who show up for one another without being asked, and who built something, a family, a production company, a body of shared work, a life that never really needed a single label to hold it together. Perlman walked into a theater one January night to watch a friend perform and left having found someone she describes, even now, as one of the people she has loved longest and most completely. DeVito has spent every decade since finding new ways to say the same thing back to her, usually without much poetry attached to it, just a plain acknowledgement, repeated in interview after interview, that they talk every day, that they show up for each other's families, and that after more than 50 years, they still understand exactly how the other one is feeling.